Ladies and gentlemen, you know, this is a funny sort of thing to have to do, and for this reason, it's exactly 1 week since you gave me a briefing on this thing, and I want, first of all, to thank you for that, because I've had a lot of briefings in my time, and I think yours was exceptionally good. Some of those little papers you prepared I've read them and reread them, and that's marvelous. But the problem is this: what kind of arrogance is it that enables me, after exactly 1 week, to tell you anything at all, except what time it is? So I really do speak to you from a great deal of humility. On the other hand, I'm a professional, and I've tried to do my job. You asked me for a cybernetic model of this situation that you're in, and I have prepared one. So if I appear arrogant in saying, well, this is how it is, I hope you will remember that I began in the way I just did. So now I'm going to pretend I'm the great expert on this matter, as from now, right? I have made a model which is a very complicated chart, which you will get soon, and I would not like that to be too alarming, because I don't know how many people in this room are familiar with systems diagrams. They look thoroughly alarming. So what I thought I'd do was to begin by showing you a condensation of my thoughts as an introduction to discussing this model, which I will distribute shortly. I've called my study this, for reasons which will be explained as we go on. DIA addresses a dilemma. Now, this dilemma was expressed in all your papers to me. I detected it. And it's expressed in the directional document that you yourselves have written. But I liked the form in which I got it from Chief Jim McGregor, and he said that, and I wrote it down. He did not say what's written in blue. What he said is we must get ahead without losing Indian identity. And I wrote that down, and I thought, yes, well, get ahead, if you really press it to the full, that's assimilation. And Indian identity, well, if you press that to the full, that could be separation. And these were the two concepts that had come out to me from your briefing. So I started from there, and then I thought, well, what kind of a dilemma is this? Is it soluble? So then I came to this thought. It is a perception. Perceptions are real and have meaning, but on the other hand, it may not be a contradiction in reality. It is only a perception at this point. Task is to steer the system, whatever the system is, we'll come to that in a minute, so that the dilemma does not become concrete in the lives of the people, presenting them with contradictions that they can't resolve. This already defines a successful band. See, the two bands we visited are surely successful in some sense. They work, and it's all happening there. And it seemed to me, talking to those chiefs and others, that they were succeeding in resolving the dilemma, which is, I think, quite implicit as a perception, at least, in the problem. And then I came to this thought, that problem bands are those for whom this task proves too much. And they need to steer the system so that the dilemma does become concrete in the lives of the people and they can't solve it. So then we say, well, what is the system that we try to steer? It is the system that dynamically relates the getting ahead with the maintaining identity. DIA is profoundly involved in these dynamics, by which I mean not sitting in rooms like this making judgments and decisions, but the actual living process that is all the time going on. That's what I mean by the dynamics. And I'm saying DIA is involved as a facilitator of those dynamics, of solving this dilemma. Now, that's my perception of you. Now, you may reject that if you like, but read this next bit first. If DIA does not hold on to the self-image of facilitator in the dynamics, it might become all these nasty things. And finally, counterproductive. And I'm quite certain that everybody present knows that there is a risk that the Indian population will think these things. Ottawa, region, district, all those things. This system we are talking about, the focus of the system that needs steering is therefore not DIA itself. I tell you that when I arrived here on Monday, I had an impression that you would expect me to make a model of this government department. I have done that for 10 government departments in Canada, I can't remember. But I suddenly realized that that was not what I had to do here, because you have done it. I have some nice diagrams from you about how the department is. Not at all. The focus is Indian. But the Indians is a construct of the public mind. Now, this is something also I have learned from you and from the district office in Sunbury, that you can't talk like that, although the public does, let us note. This is not a homogeneous whole. The focus has to be the band, which is unique, which is a community which does its thing. So I say, this is why this presentation is concerned with the dynamics of band development. I doubt that there's much else to talk about. In brackets, this presentation could have been concerned with the recursive organization of the government service, by district, by region, by national policy. Don't you think that's likely? Ah, good. We're on the same wavelength. So again, the focus is the band. This is a model of the dynamics of band development. Now I'm getting into the technology of the model I want to present to you. The diagram relates key features to each other by the use of lines and arrows. Well, you've all seen that kind of diagram, but I want to make a few points specific. It is supposed to be dynamic. The piece of paper you are going to get is, of course, static. It's a piece of paper, and it has lines and arrows. So I'm pressing the thought to you. Please think of the lines as constantly flowing, dynamics again, in the direction of the arrows, obviously. You know, it seems to me that we sophisticated people, because we're used to charts which have lines and arrows on them, assume that everybody understands that this is a flow. But I have learned the hard way that that's not right. People who have not had any training and are not used to this kind of diagram, because the diagram's static, they see the arrow simply as a dependency. They say, well, this is dependent on that because there's an arrow. Now, that is a kind of logical dependency, which is not what we're talking about. It is supposed to be dynamic. You have to try and think, when you see this diagram, please, of the whole thing moving. So that's why I say that. The whole picture is meant to be alive with movement. I just don't really know why it is that, given the state of modern technology, I can't show it to you all moving. Dr. Rabinian and I know how to do this, but it costs about $1 million a throw. and it takes a long time to produce. The key convention of the diagram is this. And it's really essential that you understand this. It's very simple, but nonetheless, I want to make it clear. You will find all over the diagram this kind of thing. An A and a B connected by a sign like that and a dotted line. Now, this thing is a comparator, which means quite simply that it is a device for comparing A with B. Now, that will measure a difference, obviously. A and B may be the same or they may be different. The measure of the difference between A and B flows away on this dotted line in order to affect something else. Call this affect feedback. Now, there are many kinds of feedback, and some of you may be very sophisticated in talking about it. You know, there is error-controlled negative feedback, and this is a big engineering issue. But for the purposes of this model, it is enough to remember that we have feedback, and that the purpose of the feedback from a comparator is to affect something else as the result of this difference, okay? Now, I'm talking about the sheet of paper that is going to be put in front of you in a minute, thanks to Dan. In the middle of it, there is an axis. You know, when you get it, it's going to look like a spider's web. So I'm trying to introduce it to you like this. We have a central axis which connects Canadian society with the band. That's that loop. And there is DIA sitting around there somewhere hoping to be helpful, the facilitator. Of course, the band is included in Canadian society, but the model studies the interconnections between them. Therefore, I pull it out. And the fact that the band is at the bottom and Canada is at the top is of no significance. It's purely diagrammatic. Have you got that picture fixed, please? There it is again. To the right of this central axis, the model looks at getting ahead. Remember the dilemma? Getting ahead and maintaining Indian identity. So you will find a central axis here when you get the diagram, and all sorts of things happening here, leading to self-sufficiency as a measure of getting ahead. Band self-sufficiency, repeat, band, it can't be anything else because all the bands are different. Band self-sufficiency, whatever that means to the band, is taken as the criterion of getting ahead. So that's the right-hand side of the model. So here's the central axis again. To the left of the central axis, the model looks at Indian identity. So again, we've got all this, and we end up with something, not self-sufficiency this time, because that's getting ahead, something I call band eudaimony, which is about Indian identity. Band eudaimony is taken as the criterion of Indian identity. Now, you may well say, what the hell is eudaimony? Never heard of it. Okay, we have a page for that. Eudaimony is a special kind of happiness. The Greeks had about 8 different words for happiness. They were very subtle, and maybe the Indians do too. I've been trying to find out. Aristotle, no less, used this word to mean something like, as well as I can put it in English, well-being or feeling good. Now that's not the kind of happiness that says, well, I have taken 6 microdot acid tablets and I am high. It's much quieter, you see. Then I make the observation, because I want to, that this thing has little relationship to the white man's term quality of life. How many houses you got, how many cars, how many boats, how many art galleries, how many orchestras, how many foreign trips do you take, and all that stuff. It is about this. If these things give you this, I reckon you're lucky. Apparently Indian languages have words that clearly mean eudaimony. Now that is something that I got out of talking to 1 or 2 of you, and I hope it's true. I would expect it, because a natural band of people must have a word for this, and I find it very fascinating that there isn't a proper word in English, because we don't recognize it. We don't even know when we feel okay. Good vibes is perhaps the nearest to it, but that's a modern expression that you won't find in a dictionary. Now let's put the total model together. Here's our central axis. Now the total model deals with the dynamic interactions between getting ahead, which is this side, self-sufficiency, and Indian identity, which is that side, which leads to band eudaimony. Most of the interconnections are informational feedbacks, these things. They're just indications that what the model is trying to teach us is mainly about all these dotted lines, and you'll find plenty of them. So this is the end of my flip chart presentation. We go into a discussion of the model under those three headings. Now that's the central axis. You can see what I mean by that. There's Canadian society right in the middle. There's the band at the bottom and the DIA in between, right? So you're oriented. Now the getting ahead model is the right-hand side from that central axis. And let's just take a look at that. Let's forget all about Indian heritage and so forth for the moment, and look at what counts as getting ahead as I have understood it. Please look at the bottom circle called the band, which is making demands. You see, straight up it says demands. And above that is DIA with all its structures making some allocations. I noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that the term handouts is used a great deal, and I would strongly advise you to give it up, because I would think that that would produce a very negative response for them. Now, here we meet our first comparator. You see that demands and allocations, there are two arrows there, and they are meant to be dynamic. They go boom, boom, boom. It is not a question of, I'm trying to point here, you remember how I said that the line should be thought of as constantly in movement? We are not talking about, I have made a demand, what is your answer? Okay, right a minute about that. I'm talking here about the constant interplay of, well, we the tribe seem to need something, and you are trying to supply it.
And the Buddha, I guess, doesn't determine what comes first, the demand or the allocation.
Well, indeed. I mean, the beauty of the model is that it doesn't tell you that. It's an ongoing process, and might easily get perverted, which is what I think my colleague is pointing out. Well, now we meet our first comparator, which is the comparison, you remember the A and B on the chart, on the flip chart, the comparison between allocation and demand. Now, I've shown two of them. They are actually the same one. There's only one way of comparing allocation and demand. But I've distinguished between them for the reason that you see. Now, the big arrow with the hole in the middle is an amplifier. That's the ordinary electronic engineer's symbol for an amplifier. And on the right-hand one, which comes down with a feedback to the band, it says amplifier of actual discrepancy. Now, there is an actual discrepancy between what we need and what we get. And what I'm pointing out by saying it's an amplifier is that people make much or little of that. We are talking all the time about people, despite this sort of engineering appearance of this chart. I'm sure you understand what I mean. If you owe me $1 and forget to give it to me, I may start going around saying you're dishonest. That would be an amplifier, because it isn't true that you're dishonest. You just forgot to give me the $1. But if I'm screwed up about this loan of the $1, I may go around saying, well, look, don't trust that chap at all. Now, those are very interesting human phenomena. The other side, we see amplifier of perceived discrepancy, which is to say that maybe the discrepancy isn't what you think it is. And the DIA may feel that they've just about met the demand made on them, but the Indian might not. I gave the example of the $1, remember, and Paul's now given another. You decide as government people to reduce a budget by 8.73%, let's say, and somehow it gets around that it's shut off. See, well, this can cause a lot of damage. Okay, well, let's just go on up the axis. There is Canadian society, which is promoting the DIA, after all. Don't bother about the top box yet, because that's all part of the feedbacks. Now, okay, let's get back and let's move a little to the right and at the bottom. If the Indians are going to get ahead, I have singled out here a list of things which you can observe called motivation, education, training, administration. So let's take a look at those. The chiefs told us with no uncertain terms that they had a problem of motivation. And please note, this is two very successful bands. So when we see on the media that Indians are all drunken layabouts, they have an even bigger problem of motivation, and obviously. So if the chiefs of successful bands feel that motivation is a problem, I think that that has to be looked at very closely. And I will do that before I've finished, because I think I've discovered some of the key things that apply to motivation. So let's just note for the moment that you have to be motivated, and let's note that this discrepancy between allocations and demands is hitting that on the left-hand side. Do you notice? Naturally, if people observe a big discrepancy between what they want and what they're getting, that has an effect on motivation. Then we had education, which I'm showing as coming down from the educational projects that you guys undertake. There ought to be a connection from the band to that, but you know, you have to be careful how much knitting you put on a diagram like this, or nobody can understand it. And what's more, I have to confess that I'm not sure to what extent the band is interested in education, except because it's required of it. And I think that's, you know, because of the getting ahead. I've got a distinct hunch, although I certainly can't prove it, that that education in Indian eyes probably means something quite different from what it means in the eyes of Canadian society, with, you know, grade 3 and all that stuff. And then training is different from education, and administration I've shown as coming from the band, because it is your policy to put administration in the hands of the band as far as possible, and that surely has got to be right. Now I'm still moving to the right at that level of the diagram. If we put motivation and education together, which you see the diagram does, then the claim is that that will generate an entrepreneurial drive in terms of getting ahead. You need to be motivated, you need to be educated, and then you've got some drive. Then it is perfectly clear that that doesn't mean to say you have any managerial skill. And this came out very much from our discussions in Sudbury, that people felt that it was possible to generate this entrepreneurial drive, but that didn't mean necessarily that you could then start $1 million business with money borrowed for the government and make a success of it. You know, that seems pretty reasonable to me. So the hope is that by administering training as distinct from education, and I think that distinction is very, very important in this context, we get some managerial skill, which then married to the entrepreneurial drive will generate enterprise. Are you still with me on the diagram? You see enterprise there. Now, enterprise is the key for getting ahead, isn't it? You know, you have to have an enterprise, and you have to be able to manage it, and you have to have the drive to do that. So that is a little model that we've just gone through of how you get to enterprise. And one of the things I wanted to say about it is this. It takes a long time to build up managerial skill. It takes a long time to educate people, of course, because they start as little babies, and before they've got a college degree, some time elapses. But you've got the same problem with management skill. And I explored a little bit with people the idea that, well, if you know you haven't got management skill, you can hire a manager, after all, from outside the reservation. And just look at the human problems that you're going to get then. I can see it so clearly, you know, that as soon as this hired manager says something nasty to an Indian, he's going to go screaming to the chief, isn't he? Or have I misunderstood? Would that be right, Elmer? So there are huge problems in acquiring management skill. I just wanted to say that. Now, out of enterprise, please note, the little box, which is self-contained, you get numbers of people employed up there and numbers of people unemployed, and then you've got a comparator, which is, of course, a completely ordinary percentage of employment. And I put that in because my colleague Paul Rubini was very interested in that in the reserve. I hadn't had a chance to talk to him about it yet, but at this point we could get that measure, which has a great deal to do with the internal economics of the band. But I couldn't put any feedbacks in there because I've got quite enough already. Now, if we start again from enterprise, you'll see that going downwards we have private projects, which this department is willing to fund, and I didn't take very much interest in that except to note that they were there. If a particular Indian person has a project, he can get it funded if the district office machinery is working. But now I was going on to look at band projects and government projects, which I've put together because it is of no concern to the way this cybernetic structure works, which they are, for the purpose of getting ahead. It matters very much in terms of Indian identity. But I put them together and I came to, and I think this is going to turn out to be very important. Ladies and gentlemen, if you buy this model at all, I think you are going to find this division very important. It took me quite a long time to get to it. I start with a classification which I call heritage projects. Now, this is pure old-fashioned Indian stuff. Logging, always done. Leatherwork, beadwork, quill work. The production of food, which is one that Elmer threw in there. Now, these are heritage projects. You see how I'm using the word. And, of course, our problem is, isn't it, that the Indians in no way can go back to 100% heritage projects because they're trapped in a reservation for a start, which is a white man's invention, I suddenly realized late one night. They can't move around the country in the way they did. They've lost a lot of the fish, a lot of the game, and so on. And I'll never forget when I was interrogating Chief Wilfred Owl about this heritage stuff, he said, well, he lives in a house with, and he was talking about his 4 television sets to me, which was fairly surprising, given that I'd just come into the... And when I was talking to him about these heritage projects, he said, well, look here, in no way am I going to live in a teepee and eat bear meat. So the heritage projects are there. And then I had the classification of foreign projects. By foreign, I mean absolutely foreign to the Indian culture. For instance, one of these chiefs is talking about building a motel. Well, that's not very Indian. Then there are discos. The reference to Korean gift shops refers to the fact, and this really shattered me, that there is a gift shop selling tomahawks marked made in Korea. What I call tourism B, which is a non-Indian way of looking after the stranger. I haven't managed to define this very clearly, but I hope to convey to you what I mean. It's like building the motel, and it is not hospitality. It is ripping off the stranger. So these I thought of as foreign projects. And then finally I got to this category, which, as I was saying, I think may prove to be an important notion of transformed heritage projects. Now, if you take the original heritage and say, yeah, but that was 100 years ago and now we have all this technology, and Indians are not blocked off from using technology, they're citizens like everybody else, then there is this rather gentle idea, I put it to you in that light, of transforming the things that Indians always did, which is the heritage project, into a transformed heritage project which is not offensive, which is not foreign. Now, we saw sawmills. Okay, you couldn't have a computerized, machine-driven sawmill in the heritage, but it is, I submit, a natural development, because they always cut down trees and used them, and so, poof. Paper pulp, also. Marinas, I just love. I mean, Indians understand the water and the surround and the whole little ecology at the edge of the lake. And if the transformation of that is to have a marina, then that seems to me to be a very natural notion. I put in mining there because, after all, the land, if there are minerals in it, and modern science discovers a mineral that the original Indians never heard of, it would be natural, again, as a transformed heritage, to mine it, wouldn't it? And there I put tourism A. I've already said that tourism B is the rip-off of tourists, but tourism A is meant to refer to what the Indians would have regarded as being hospitable. Mind you, you have to pay for it. So I'm not being, this is the get-ahead model, remember. On the other hand, I feel that there should be some sensitivity to the idea that what one does with people who want to use reservation land, leases on cottages and things like that, should be sensitive to the Indian heritage. See, I heard those people say in the training session that to lease land, you might just as well give it up because it's renewable lease and the sense is that you've lost the land. So I think that this middle box that we're talking about here, the transformed heritage, is something that you people might very well think a lot about. I'm sure you do, but I've made distinctions here, and I think that one might be valuable. So now moving to the right, we get to this thing I've called an assimilation meter, and you see what that means. If we regard the heritage projects and the transformed heritage projects as in some sense legitimate in Indian terms, and then make a comparator with foreign projects, which I am suggesting are illegitimate in Indian terms as far as maintaining identity goes, then we have something called an assimilation meter, which says, well, when the foreign projects have completely taken over from the other two, Indians are assimilated in Canadian society and they don't exist any longer. And if it's of interest and is an Indian ambition to maintain identity, which is where we started, then this meter has to register very low. And if all that's true, then the way that DIA looks at applications should be watching this so-called assimilation meter pretty closely, it seems to me. Well, now we've dropped to the bottom part of that diagram. I'm on the extreme right now, where the total of all the projects, government projects, band projects, and private projects, which represent enterprise, generate a total revenue. And under that, we generate a cost. And I've distinguished between the costs of education, training, and administration, which add up to the cost of, I've called it, of entrepreneurial servicing, okay? The capital cost servicing, that's gone into all this, and the non-entrepreneurial O&M. I mean, that's the rest of it, which generates a total cost. So now we have another comparator, which is talking about self-sufficiency. There's two more things to say about this side of the diagram. If you look at Canadian society, the big circle, you see that also generates an entrepreneurial drive, as I've called it. And you'll see I've stuck a comparator between the Canadian notion of entrepreneurial drive and the band notion of entrepreneurial drive, and I have called it a peer comparator. Now, it's perfectly evident that the Indian who is thinking in terms of getting ahead is going to compare himself with the Canadian entrepreneur. And that feedback goes into motivation. That was a discovery of doing this cybernetic study for me. I was very interested because of the emphasis put on motivation by the Indian chiefs to try and find out from the diagram where that motivation would come from, because there's no use sitting around and saying I can't motivate people. When I hear that, I think, well, now, come on. where are the triggers, you know? And I think that must be one of them, and that's why I'm drawing your attention to it, that the Indian who is trying to make a success will be comparing himself with his non-Indian equivalent, and that will feed back to affect his motivation. Now, the other one I want to point out to you is if you look at the self-sufficiency comparator, you with me? Over on the bottom right, the first feedback goes up the page and right across to something called valve. Can you follow that? Good. Now,
right below Canadian Society.
And between Canadian Society and DIA structures on the central axis is a valve. Now, this caused me a great deal of meditation. If self-sufficiency is increasing, then this valve is likely to cut off money because the need is diminishing, right? So now I draw your attention to the feedback coming out of the valve and down to motivation. That sign there, it's the only one on the diagram, is the sign for an attenuator, and it's called demotivator as self-sufficiency rises. So I think that loop, which is running right around the diagram here, is saying, just be careful, you know, if you set the target of self-sufficiency and then the more self-sufficient you get, the less money you get, what are you going to do to motivation? I mean, it depends how serious the guy you're trying to motivate is, but he may say, well, I think I'll just sit on the grass and enjoy the sun and take the money instead of... There's a bad thing there that needs watching, is what I'm saying. That's why I called it a demotivator. I couldn't get any further with the thinking than that. But the point of drawing charts like this is to try and understand where there may be counterproductive effects. So I think we've said enough for the moment about the right-hand side of the diagram, and let's turn to the left, which is, we've been talking about the model of getting ahead. This is the model of Indian identity. First thing I want you to notice about this is, inside the circle called the band, I have shown the chief and council and the consultation of elders, which really must be part of the Indian heritage thing. And I've shown the administrator, the educational advisor, the financial advisor, and the planner. Okay. Now, you'll notice that it is the DIA which structures that. I wonder if an Indian band would ever have come up with an educational advisor, for instance, or a financial advisor, for that matter. These are imposed notions, it seems to me, or that's what I'm suggesting. Maybe okay, but let us note it. And let us note where they come from. If you go to Canadian Society at the top, it says generates accepted value structure. Now that is the value structure of a capitalist, rich nation. With it goes an accepted organizational structure which says, well, you know, we have a financial director and a general manager and a finance director and all those things. And accepted managerial norms, which say you must make a profit, and there are things called cost centers and all manner of stuff of that kind. Now follow my line, please. It comes down here and it says, this structures the DIA itself. And I defy you to say it doesn't, because if it didn't, you would have the Auditor General after you, see? And then the line goes on down and structures the band by saying administrators, educational advisors, and so on. Now, I think it's very necessary to point this out because we're on the side of the diagram which is dealing with Indian heritage, with Indian identity, and already we're finding, you with me? that in the process of getting ahead, we are foisting onto the band certain norms, certain ways of organizing that may be quite foreign to them. I suspect that they are. Okay, now, just as Canadian society generates an accepted value structure, the band generates an accepted value structure. Now, this comes out of how it behaves, just as it does for Canadian society. Also in the picture is this thing that caused me so much trouble, and I'm fairly happy with the way it's worked out, and it's mainly as a result of talking to Elmer that I've got something that I can live with here. I've got a box there called Indian Heritage Black Box. The point is, see, if I say, as a white man, patronizing to an Indian, which I did, I tried not to be patronizing, but the question is by nature patronizing. Would you mind telling me, Chief, what is your heritage? He looks a bit thoughtful. And the fact is that if anybody said that to any one of us, how the hell would we answer it? You know, we have some notions of what our heritage is, but we don't have lists stuck on the wall saying, this is my heritage, keep off. So this is why I called it a black box. It exists, and it is a matter of study by anthropologists and others, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm prepared to believe there's something there which I don't understand. What I am trying to understand is how that heritage affects the sensitivity of Indians. And so out of my conversation with Elmer came this notion of this, well, mind you, I can't blame him for this. This was after he left, but it's a result of the conversation. Something I call the sensitivity transformer. Indians are sensitive to these affairs. It's no good doing a sort of theoretical, logical exercise on them and saying, well, since there aren't any fish, it's an academic question whether you have fishing rights. Maybe it is not an academic question. Language again, you see. We only visited 2 tribes. One of them seems pretty strong on language. The other said quite flatly, well, a lot of the kids can't speak it. Now, just how important is that? I don't know. But it certainly is something to which people are sensitive. What is the role of the chief? Now, when I asked Chief McGregor that, I got a most beautiful answer, which I'll always treasure, and therefore I want to repeat to you. First of all, there was a young Indian present, whom some of you must know. Is his name Danny? Buddy, yeah. Who defined the matter as follows. He said, the chief is responsible for all the affairs of the band and other related matters. Which I think is just a beautiful remark. So after we'd all laughed our heads off, the chief came through with the following. He said, look, we were building a house on a plot, a small plot, and it's all laid out and there isn't much space. And they came to me as the chief to ask me where to dig the hole. And I went there, and really there wasn't any alternative, and it was all settled anyway, and I said, dig it there. And they said, right. Now, how is one to interpret that story if one has any sensitivity? It seems as if the chief imparts a blessing on this thing. Now, this is the sort of thing I want to get sensitive to. I would like to live on an Indian reservation for a bit in order to understand it better. But I've only had a week, and that's what I'm feeling for. And what I'm trying to say to you about this piece of the model is, like I was saying about the hunting and fishing rights, is that our ordinary economic criteria and categorizations, you can't just slap them on a community which is working in a different dimension. Well, you can, but don't if you want to maintain the Indian heritage, it seems to me, and Indian identity. Now, I've seen that happen. I mean, I apologized earlier for trying to explain all about Indians to you after 1 week. On the other hand, I have worked for 25 years in developing countries, and I've seen this happen so often, where people who want to help come along and slap the whole model on top of the people there, and they can't handle it. It's not what they're about, because it's all expressed in economic terms and so on and so forth. I'd never forget the birth control campaign in India. excuse me, a very long time ago now, when a whole teams of Americans arrived and started telling the Indians, you know, what caused babies, you know. Can you imagine? You have a 5,000-year-old culture here. The Indians, I'm sorry, those Indians, Indian Indians, oh dear, this language is getting difficult. You know, those people had as many children as were required to keep the parents in their old age, which started at about 35, because they were clapped out. So you have to have enough children to look after you for quite a long time. You've got a hell of an infant mortality rate, etc., etc. And I made a model of that, and the average Indian births of about 12 or 14 children was exactly what was required to maintain the economic equilibrium. And if you come along in the middle of that and say, God almighty, 14 children, now this thing is called a condom, and that's what they did. See? That's what I mean, I use that example as lacking sensitivity, and I am very delicate about this area for this reason, and I hope you are too. I'm sure you are. Now, what I've done with that sensitivity box is to set up comparators which measure expectations and satisfactions for each of these things, make the comparison, and feed it into the concept of band eudaimonia. And what I'm suggesting is that this sense of well-being, good feelings, good vibes in the band is a function of those comparisons. Now, you may say, well, there's going to be a lot more to it than that, and maybe there is, but I have begun a process here of trying to pick on issues which are sensitive and to which, therefore, DIA should be paying close attention. You'll notice that an arrow goes straight into band eudaimonia, both from the black box of the Indian heritage, which is to say there's something going in there that I don't know about, and also from the accepted value structure. So we've got three things affecting band eudaimonia. The one I've tried to analyze, plus two that I can't analyze, but which I can point to. And out of band eudaimonia comes a feedback which goes into DIA, of course, which is trying to understand whether the band is in a state of well-being, but much more particularly goes on and comes down to that box motivation again. So now we've got four elements of motivation, which I think that my study has pinpointed. And I'd like just to remind you of them, because this motivation thing, I think, is a central issue. The first one is the sense from the comparator between allocations and demands that they are being fairly treated. The second, as we go along the diagram, is the one I've just mentioned, which is the band eudaimonia, which says, well, we feel good. The third is the one coming from the valve, and the fourth is coming from the peer comparator. So I think we have identified, although doubtless dozens of others, but as I say, I worry very much when well-intentioned people sit around talking about motivation and saying, well, perhaps we should paint the walls yellow and they'll be happier. You know, we have to try and find out what are the triggers of motivation, and I think there are four of them there, and at least one of them is pretty dangerous, the one I call demotivator. This is band eudaimonia, and the nearest I can get to taking that apart. I repeat that you could probably, if you wanted to, work on that and refine it, but as a start, I don't think anybody could possibly deny that those six things are sensitive issues. I think I've covered the left-hand side. So just to remind you of the general structure of my presentation, we looked at the right-hand side, which leads to getting ahead and has this danger of assimilation. We've now looked at the thing which leads to band eudaimonia and has the danger of separation. See, those two things are presented as threats. And I quite agree with you, they're both bad. Where we want to look at how all this ties together. There's a flow to the right, which is getting ahead, and a flow to the left, which is about Indian identity. Now let's take a look at these feedbacks. If we start with the self-sufficiency comparator, bottom right. Now, obviously, this is going to feed back into the value structure of the band. And we have here a thing which I've called the culture modifier. See, if you start out, and I'm sure you do, although you may say I'm wrong, but I feel sure you do, with an Indian culture which does not have anything at all comparable to the measure of success that is given by all this economics over here. I really can't believe that that the old Indian, I mean, in olden times, really computed in those terms, that success was, in his eyes, this sort of economics. Maybe it was good if you had more, no, I should say, in some societies, some old societies, you did get something like it, that I've got more cows than you have. But this isn't my image of Indian society, and the Indians present can tell me if I'm wrong. But even if there was an element, it's certainly not dominant, is it? And as long as this self-sufficiency thing becomes something which has to be recognized by the band, it's going to affect its accepted value structure, and that is a threat to Indian identity. Now, in the same way, if we look at the self-sufficiency comparator and follow it upwards, it comes back and it hits a thing at the top of the page, right up there at the top, called judgmental worthiness of Indians, which feeds into Canadian society. Now, of course, this is all about whether Canadians think that Indians are drunken layabouts, or whether they say, my God, these Indians are doing a big business and that's just great. That comes out of the self-sufficiency comparator. And of course it affects what money is going to be available through DIA and down the main axis, isn't it? How Canadians see Indians. Now, I should have put on that line a media filter, because how Canadians see Indians, or anything else I may add, is grossly affected by what the media choose to tell. And you as government, and this is a thing I've flogged in Ottawa till I'm nearly purple, but I just don't get much reaction. I mean, not about Indians, of course, but in general. The government cannot fulfill its need to tell the public what it's doing by issuing government papers, because nobody reads them. And they say, well, we published all these books. And I say, but nobody's read them. See? What happens is the media comes along, looks rapidly through the book looking for anything that looks a bit spicy, and bang! That's what the public hears. This won't do. The government has got to give a lot more thought to that. So whatever distortions are on this line, the line exists, and what happens to the Indians coming down the main axis will certainly be affected by this self-sufficiency comparator. It'll also be affected, by the way, by the assimilation meter, because if Canadians think that they are assimilating Indians, or failing to assimilate Indians, or whatever the individual Canadian wants to do with Indians, will reflect the views that he has in this box called Canadian society, and may result in pressure on MPs and all the rest of it. So those are the feedbacks there. Oh, and of course the assimilation meter also comes round to the band, and again is a culture modifier. Because just think of it in terms of the youth. If they are being assimilated in terms of my model of foreign projects, then they will feel less and less for the accepted value structure of their grandfathers. So I'm very interested in that culture modifier. Now, taking the loop from the other side, if we look at the extreme left of the diagram, we've got an accepted value structure of Canadian society, an accepted value structure of the band, and there's a huge, you see it right out there on the left, a comparator called perceived values comparator. Now, this is where we observe that Indians are different from other people in Canada or are not different from other people in Canada. Makes that comparison. And I am suggesting that that feeds back on the top left-hand corner into the idea of whether Indians are worthy or not. And it also feeds down, let us note, to the bottom box, which is the first time I mentioned that, at the right at the bottom. The Indians are perfectly capable of judging the worthiness of Canadian society, and will do so. Now, it seems to me that that is a good point for me to finish, because it's easy for a government department to, well, roughly speaking, to be paternalistic and say, well, we have to look after these people. But these are a people, and they may reject it all in their minds and say, well, nonetheless, we'll take the money. And I'm still trying to be sensitive, you see. I did get some feeling that, of course I could be quite wrong about this, that the whole thing could become quite jocular to an Indian. When I'm doing a thing like this, I try and put myself in the guy's position. You know, well, if that's the sort of kind of nonsense performance I have to go through, I'll do it, you know. From here, from Canadian society, to value structures and norms of various kinds, which imposed on the, which create DIA in the structure it is in, force the band to behave in certain ways in order to do this, in order to take money, and generally be approved of, and come back here. What happens over here? I mean, with all this going on. Now, either, given all this is going on, you can kill off the one thing you're trying to preserve, which is the Indian heritage, or you can have some enormous stop on this culture modifier, which says, we'll do it because that's the ritual fire dance, or the rain dance, or something, but we are laughing up our sleeves and we are preserving identity. And I hope that's what they do. If this is a reasonable representation, and if I'm right in my original comments, really, I'd like to go through the flip chart again. Now, you've seen it, but you can do that privately if you will, because there's a condensation of my thinking on that. If DIA, scrub the middle of that box, scrub what's in that box called DIA. Say, well, that's our diagram, that's DIA. DIA is supposed to be a facilitator. How shall we organize it? Would you come up with that arrangement? I very much doubt it.
And this is exactly and precisely what I was after last Monday when we had our preliminary briefing, and now we're doing the debriefing. It was to, in effect, if you like, turn Stafford loose and see what he could see, and see what things he could take out of the little speeches that were made by our program managers, papers, plans that we had provided to Stafford and to Paul several weeks before you arrived, and particularly our directional plan, which we're, I think, especially proud of, because that plan was developed in a very special way, and it was developed and not written by our staff here, as someone suggested. In fact, it was developed at a series of retreats that we had with the Indian leadership. So that those concepts that come forward in that paper are those things which have been articulated by the elected representatives of the Indian people from the different parts of Ontario. So this represents to me another one of the pieces, if you like, another one of the components of the overview that we are attempting to develop in this region in partnership with the Indian people. And I think all of us around here know and sense that there are tremendous implications and consequences. I'm sure any one of us could start talking here about the implications and so on that come out of this kind of thing, but all I want to say right now is that This is, it's more than helpful. It will be a tool which we're going to use, which our managers can use, which the Indian leaders will take this, your charts and this chart in discussions about what is going on at the band, in discussions about how should we be appropriately organized. I don't think it's any secret to anyone in this room that we know very well, Stafford, that what is in this box right here is not appropriate to the times that we're living in. We're not unaware of that. I don't think anyone should pretend otherwise. We're not organized in any way at the present time to give emphasis to those things which Indian people have been telling us are priorities. We're not organized to give any concern to the issue that you raised toward the end of your presentation about relations with the public, with the various publics, with the way information is flowing. We, in many cases, do not have the kind of organization which allows people even to act as facilitators because of the way the present thing is set up. And we're very well aware that this thing requires a tremendous transformation if we are to really act as a support and as a facilitator to bring about some of these objectives which, as Johnny said, the Indian people have been trying to say for years, that these are some things they'd like to give importance to. And so I think that we're on the verge in the next couple of years here of a real breakthrough.